Can the legacy of trauma be passed down the generations? Our children and grandchildren are shaped by the genes they inherit from us, but new research is revealing that experiences of hardship or violence can leave their mark too. In 1864, nearing the end of the U.S. Civil War, conditions in the Confederate prisoner of war camps were at their worst. There was such overcrowding in some camps that the prisoners, Union Army soldiers from the North, each had the square footage of a grave. Prisoner death rates soared. For those who survived, the harrowing experiences marked many of them for life. They returned to society with impaired health, worse job prospects, and shorter life expectancy. But the impact of these hardships did not stop with those who experienced it. It also had an effect on the prisoners' children and grandchildren, which appeared to be passed down to the male line of families. While their sons and grandsons had not suffered the hardships of the POW camps, and if anything were well provided for through their childhoods, they suffered higher rates of mortality than the wider population. It appeared the POWs, prisoners of war, had passed on some element of their trauma to their offspring. But unlike most inherited conditions, with this was not caused by mutations to the genetic code itself. Instead, the researchers were investigating a much more obscure type of inheritance: how events in someone's lifetime can change the way their DNA is expressed, and how that change can be passed on to the next generation. This is the process of epigenetics, where the readability of expression of genes is modified without changing the DNA code itself. Tiny chemical tags are added to or removed from our DNA in response to changes in the environment in which we are living. This tax turns genes on or off, offering a way of adapting to changing conditions without inflicting a more permanent shift in our genomes. But if these epigenetic changes acquired during life can be indeed also be passed on to later generations, the implications would be huge. Your experiences during your lifetime, particularly traumatic ones, would have a very real impact on your family for generations to come. There are a growing number of studies that support the idea that the effects of trauma can reverberate down the generations through epigenetics. For the POWs in the Confederate camps, these epigenetic changes were a result of the extreme overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition. The men had to survive on small rations of corn, and many died from diarrhea and scurvy. The sons of POWs had an 11% higher mortality rate than the sons of non-POW veterans. Costa and her colleagues studied a health record of nearly 4,600 children whose fathers had been POWs, comparing them to just over 15,300 children of veterans of the war who had not been captured. The sons of POWs had an 11% higher mortality rate than the sons of non-POW veterans. Other factors, such as the father's socioeconomic status and the son's job and marital status couldn't account for the higher mortality rate the researchers found. This excess mortality was mainly due to higher rates of cerebral hemorrhages. The sons of Poe veterans were also slightly more likely to die from cancer, but the daughters of former Poes appeared to be immune to these effects. The unusual sex-linked pattern was one of the reasons that made Costa suspect that these health differences were caused by epigenetic changes. But first, Costa and her team had to rule out that it was a genetic effect. What could have happened in that a genetic trait which enabled the father to survive the camp, a tendency toward obesity for example, was then bad during normal times, says Costa. However, if you look within families, there are only effects among sons born after but not before the war. If were a genetic trait, then children born before and after the war would be equally likely to show the reduced life expectancy. With a genetic cause ruled out, the most plausible explanation left was an epigenetic effect. The hypothesis is that there's an epigenetic effect on the Y chromosome, says Costa. This effect is consistent with studies in remote Swedish villages where shortage in food supply had a generation effect down the male line, but not the female line. But what if the increased risk of death was due to a legacy of the father's trauma that had nothing to do with DNA? What if traumatized fathers were more likely to abuse their children, leading to long-term health consequences, and sons bore the brunt of it more than daughters?